Hi everyone. Thank you so much to everyone for coming. So my name is Mason Dretz. I'm the co-head of advertising for the Music Council at Northern. So this afternoon we have a very special guest coming to speak to us about his education, profession, and his life in music for the last 20 years. Dr. Andrew Scott is a guitarist, pianist, composer, arranger, and a full professor and the program coordinator for the Bachelor of Music at Humber College. He is highly skilled and talented and is someone that I have had the pleasure to play with and talk music with. Please give a warm welcome to Dr. Andrew Scott.
Thank you, everyone. Yeah, that's very nice. And please, there's no need to call me Dr. Andrew Scott. I mean, Herr Doctor Professor is just fine. No, that's a joke. Yes, you can call me Andy. Everybody does, please, as Mason Drutz does as well. So thank you very much, Mason, for inviting me here today. I really appreciate the opportunity. Maybe what some people say about me, I don't always like to talk about myself, but I'm happy to start there, certainly. I grew up in Toronto. I grew up in, I guess, what then was called East York. And actually, I went to high school just down the street from where you all are. I went to Leaside High School. Before that, I went to a school called Besborough, although I grew up on the other side of the Leaside Bridge, sort of on the Pape and O'Connor kind of area, if you know that part of town. I probably should have gone to East York Collegiate, but for whatever reason, I ended up going to Leaside. My mom was a wonderful musician. In fact, that's her portrait of Bach hanging right behind me over my shoulder. She was a piano player. She was a really interesting woman. She was very talented. She had perfect pitch, which I don't have. She had an amazing set of ears, and she had an unbelievable musical memory. She knew a million tunes that she could kind of sit down and play seemingly at ease. And obviously, I grew up listening to her play in the family home, but I also grew up listening to her play professionally. She used to play for a long time at the Inn on the Park Hotel, which was one of the first Four Seasons hotels in Canada, actually, and in Toronto. So she used to do that. She used to play a number of different restaurants as well, including Wellington's and La Scala. And she was also a church organist. So I grew up listening to her play in all of those different contexts. So I guess I give you this sort of background because that was a big part of how I grew up listening to her music. And when she was playing at the Inn on the Park Hotel, it was really, actually, it's worth sort of telling this story. The Inn on the Park, which I don't think is there any longer, but it was at Eglinton and Leslie in Toronto. She used to play what I guess you'd call cocktail hour. So she played every night, Monday through Friday, 5 till 7 or 5 till 7:30, something like that. And I used to go after school, like when I was in grade 7 and 8, and then I guess a little bit in high school, maybe even earlier. I used to go and I would see her. And I would hang out sort of in the staff lounge, and I would listen to her play. And there was a very famous Canadian musician named Glenn Gould. I don't know if anybody has ever heard that name, but Glenn Gould actually went to Malvern High School, and he grew up in the Beach area, the east end of Toronto. And he was a world-renowned musician, world-renowned piano player. He was also, I think, fairly well known as an eccentric kind of guy. And at the time, he had given up his apartment. He used to have an apartment right at St. Clair and Yonge, but he'd given it up. And he had a cottage that was out in sort of the area, I guess I would say, in near the Kawarthas area. That was where his cottage, like sort of near Aurelia. He had a cottage out in that direction. And then when he was in Toronto, he would actually stay in a hotel room at the Four Seasons because he had a very topsy-turvy life in the sense that he stayed up all night and then he slept all day. And the Four Seasons Inn on the Park was one of the first hotels to have 24-hour room service in Toronto. And so it used to suit his needs. But I tell you this because it was pretty neat to be visiting. I mean, how do you think it felt for my mom to be playing the piano in the lounge as Glenn Gould would walk by from his hotel room to basically to the dining room to have dinner? And he ate the same meal every night for, up until he died. But I used to see him too. And that was sort of an interesting kind of early exposure to, I don't know, I guess in a way I would say to genius, frankly. I mean, Glenn Gould was absolutely a musical genius, so to get to sort of see him up close. I mean, I heard him on recordings. I ultimately went to his funeral, actually. because of the connection through my mom. But and I give this context of my mother also to say, like, she also played in a couple of big bands. She had a lot of connections because she used to play in the supper club at the Royal York Hotel in a place called the Imperial Ballroom. And so whenever the big band leaders would come through, you know, Tony Bennett, Julie London, Duke Ellington, Count Basie, these musicians, my mom, some of this is before I was born, but my mom got to know these people. And so whenever they were in Toronto, when I was born, I would meet, you know, I got the opportunity to meet a lot of wonderful musicians that way, including a great musician who's still alive. He's in his 90s. He lives in Toronto. He lives around Davisville and Yonge, named DiNovi. And Gene was somebody who played with Charlie Parker. He's on a Lester Young recording. He played with Benny Goodman. He was a wonderful jazz piano player, originally from New York City. He moved out to Los Angeles, where he accompanied, he was the music director of the Dinah Shore show. She was like an early talk show host. And he got to play with a lot of singers, people like Carmen McRae and Lena Horne and musicians like that. So Gene moved up to Toronto in the 70s. So I'm 50 years old. I was born in 1970. And so when Gene moved up here in the early 70s, one of the few people that he knew in Toronto, he and his wife, were my mom and dad, because of my mom's connection through the Royal York Hotel. And so Gene was a big influence on me growing up as well. So I guess I will just say, like, I was always immersed with music. You know, I took piano lessons. I had this really exemplary musician in terms of my mom, obviously in the home with me growing up, and then all of the colleagues and the friends of hers. So that was really engaging. And I took I took piano lessons. I did all the things that probably many of you have done as well. I took, private piano lessons. And I, to be honest, I wasn't very good. I mean, I think I was sort of maybe what you might call naturally good at certain aspects of music, but I didn't really practice very much. And then, like a lot of people of my generation, I wasn't really interested in the piano that much. I was interested in the guitar, and so I gravitated towards the guitar. And I always knew jazz guitar players because I would hear them on the recordings that my mom played. So my mom and dad had a really great vinyl record collection, much of which I actually have inherited and I have here behind me. But I used to listen to people like Barney Kessel and Tal Farlow and Herb Ellis and George Benson, Grant Green, Wes Montgomery, Kenny Burrell. I don't know if any of these names are meaningful to anybody on the group, but on the call. But I used to hear these musicians playing on records that my mom and dad would play around the house. So I certainly had the sound of jazz guitar in my head for a long time. But I would say my interest when I was like a teenager was more like I wanted to be Stephen Stills or Joni Mitchell, or, I was interested, or the Beatles. I really was interested in that kind of singer-songwriter, James Taylor, Carole King, those kinds of musicians. I really liked that sort of acoustic quality of the music and the more confessional type songs. Maybe in some ways that was a good blending of my interests in terms of music, but I've always been somebody who is a creative writer, and I wrote, poetry and short stories and lyrics and things like that. So it was nice to kind of blend that together. And I will say one of the nice things about music too was that music is sort of a social lubricant. I mean, music got me the opportunity to meet lots of friends in high school, and I was playing in bands, and I did the Battle of the Bands competition. I remember Upper Canada College, UCC, used to always host, I think, the finals used to be in the old Masonic Temple, which is at Davenport and Yonge. But maybe the semifinals was always at the UCC school and campus. And it's interesting, I got to know a lot of musicians that way. I mean, in fact, musicians that I still know or still follow. Musicians like the Bourbon Tabernacle Choir, who went to Lawrence Park High School, Chris Brown, Kate Fenner, Dave Wall, some of those musicians who still are in music. Jamie Shields of the New Deal, Dan Kurtz, who is one half of the band Dragonette, he produced Leslie Feist's first record. He wrote for Duran Duran, Cyndi Lauper, the Scissor Sisters. He was somebody back. he goes by the name Chili Gonzalez, but his name is Jason Beck. He went to a Crescent School at the time, and he had bands that would play in these sorts of Battle of the Band competitions, and we're all roughly around the same age. So, you know, it's interesting. There's like, and these were all like really, really early opportunities to meet, listen to, and soak in, you know, the talents of a lot of very interesting people in Toronto, you know, that were going to different high schools around. So yeah, I just say that because, you know, I mean, music is, I guess, in some ways similar to sports like that. You know, if you're a good athlete in high school, you can kind of find and form community maybe around that interest. And the same thing is true of music. So I guess I will say that I started actually playing like sort of taking guitar lessons when I got to high school. There was a guy named Andy Barakis, who was my music teacher. He was the music teacher at Leaside. But he also had a guitar class. I played French horn in the band. I wasn't very good. I will spare you the story of when I left the French horn while waiting for the Flemington Tark bus one time, and that was the end of my band career. But I played guitar, you know, through high school, and then at the end of high school, I didn't really know sort of what I wanted to do. I played in a lot of different bands and at these talent shows. I'd actually done some, I guess what you might call professional gigs. I mean, I remember there was a friend of mine who had an uncle who owned a restaurant that I played at. Believe it or not, there was a club called Larry's Hideaway, which I'm sure nobody on this call maybe remembers, but it was near the Maple Leaf Gardens. And it was a complete dive bar. And how they let me play there, I have no idea, because I was seriously underage. I mean, I couldn't have had a beer in the club, but I played on the stage. So I was doing some of that stuff. I was already kind of playing quasi-professionally in high school. But I was relatively conflicted at the end of high school. You know, I wanted to do something that maybe seemed that there was going to be a better chance of employment at the end of that. And I also wanted to engage with some other interests of mine. So I ended up going to Carleton University. I went to the journalism program. And that was good. You know, I was happy to have gotten into that program. It was sort of prestigious at the time, but I ended up actually playing more guitar, really. I ended up, you know, playing in bands, doing a bunch of gigs, and also just sort of like socially playing a lot of music. And it became pretty obvious to me that Carleton wasn't going to be a long-lasting thing for me. So at any rate, I ended up dropping out. You know, I'm sure my parents weren't thrilled, but I ended up dropping out. And I actually enrolled in the 3-year diploma program at Humber College, which at that point was out at the North Campus. So it was in Rexdale area. And there I got introduced to really a very immersive jazz education. And I did that. I studied privately with a lot of good people. It was a very competitive program, as it still is. You know, I learned a ton. I played in really good ensembles. I had the opportunity to travel a little bit. And yeah, that was a great experience for me. Right around this time, I also had some of my first sort of professional opportunities, because I remember I was in, I guess, my second year, and I got an opportunity to go to tour Europe with a band leader. So I actually lived in Switzerland for about 3 months. Again, how I sort of fudged this with my education. I mean, I took off some time on Christmas. I took some time off before and afterwards. And you know, and at the time, the college was pretty flexible, and they let me do that. But I was out on the road for about 2.5 months, playing all over Europe, stationed in a place called Arosa, Switzerland, which was a lot of fun. And then I came back, and around that same time, I met some musicians at the college who I ended up starting a group with. And the band was called One Step Beyond, and it was an instrumental 7-piece kind of, I don't know, funk fusion sort of jazz hodgepodge of music. And, you know, and in many ways, I will say that the success of that band, I mean, I will acknowledge or credit that band actually helped develop the live music scene on College Street in Toronto, because at the time, College was I mean, it's still it's sort of Italian restaurants and that sort of thing, but there was a club called Lola's Lounge that was looking to try and, you know, get some audience and get some people in the door. And we ended up doing a residency there, a residency at the Rivoli, which well, I think still is, although I've heard that it's being sold, but on Queen Street. And then a club called Cerveceria, which is like a restaurant a little further west, but also on College. And so we were playing like 2-3 nights a week. This is in the 90s, you know, so this is like 94 to 97, something like that. So I would have been, yeah, I mean, I would have been 23, 24, 25 years old, that sort of time frame. And we were playing a lot of gigs. We ended up getting signed to a record company called Mo-Funk Records, which was out of Vancouver. And we ended up putting out, actually, believe it or not, I mean, I'm just old enough that my first recording was on vinyl. So there's a vinyl record and then subsequently compact discs, CDs. And that band was actually pretty successful. We had the opportunity to tour Canada multiple times. We went down through the States a bunch. We put out a lot of records. I guess probably the high point was we sold out the Opera House, which is at Broadview and Queen, 2 nights, and that's probably got a capacity of, I don't know, 1,100 people, something like that. So, you know, we were sort of a going concern for a Toronto band, especially one without a vocalist or really without a major record label behind us. We were sort of a classic, you know, independent band. We had a van, we toured all over. So I've probably played every small town, you know, right across Canada and all through the United States, actually as far down as Mexico, in fact. And that was a really, really great experience. So one of the things that happened around that time was we had an agent, and the agent also represented somebody named Merle Saunders. And Merle was a piano player and a keyboard player, Hammond organ B3 player, who grew up in New York, but he lived in California, lived in the Bay Area of California. And he had become friends with a guy named Jerry Garcia. And Jerry Garcia was a guitar player who played in a band called the Grateful Dead, which were sort of very well-known group. And Merle Saunders and Jerry Garcia used to play a lot of records, do a lot of records together. And when Jerry Garcia wasn't playing with the Grateful Dead and he had his solo side projects, he would play with Merle Saunders. So Merle was represented by the same agent. And so Merle would, when Merle would play in anywhere sort of like in Toronto, Boston, Maine, like anywhere on the sort of the East Coast, New York City, he would bring his band in from the Bay Area and we would open for him. So we were going down to New York a lot, going down to these places and playing gigs as the opening act for Merle Saunders and the Merle Saunders Band. What ended up happening was Merle really liked the band. We had a conga player, we had 2 horn players, so we had a trumpet player and a saxophone player. And Merle really liked the sound of the group. And so he started fleshing out his band with some of the members of our band. And I guess it didn't take him too long to think, well, why do I need to fly my band all the way from California every time I come to the East Coast when I can just use these musicians? And that's exactly what happened. We then basically became Merle's backup band. We backed him up on a number of his own gigs, as well as sort of being the opening act for him too. And that was sort of a notch up yet again in terms of the professional experiences. And that was good. That went, you know, for a little while. And then I guess for me, you know, I sort of thought, I don't know, I was 26, 27. And I thought, you know, I had a 3-year diploma from Humber College. I didn't have an undergraduate degree. I'm not sure that I wanted to sort of be on the road playing music for the rest of my life, or not necessarily wasn't even sure if I sort of was good enough to be able to do that and have a meaningful career. But music was still very important to me. So what I ended up doing was I applied, sort of on a whim actually, I applied to New England Conservatory of Music in Boston for a master's program. It's a master's of musicology that they had. And I ended up getting accepted, and I got accepted. I had to write the GRE, you know, to go down to the States to, which is like a standardized test that I had to do. And I had to do a lot of auditions as a musician, but I ended up getting down there. I ended up having some scholarship money. So I actually lived in Boston for 2 years. And in many ways, I would say that I'm very fortunate to have had the opportunity because I didn't actually have an undergraduate degree. I had a 3-year diploma. And yet by going to the States and by, I guess, sort of proving myself in terms of the standardized tests, but also in terms of my musicianship, I was able to get into a master's program. I did that for 2 years. And then I had a few opportunities. I could have stayed in Massachusetts. I got a scholarship to go to Brandeis University. I got a partial scholarship to go to the City University of New York. And I got a scholarship to go to York University, which was in Toronto. And, you know, I had a Canadian girlfriend. I had community here in Toronto. So I ended up coming back to Toronto, to York. So I came back when I was 29. I came back in the year 2000, in the summer of 2000. And I ended up doing a PhD at York, which took me 6 years to do. But during that time, it was really when I came back to Toronto in 2000 that I really tried to establish my own solo music career. So I recorded a number of records with somebody named Jim Clayton, of the Clayton Scott Group. And then I did a number of records for a bunch of jazz labels, for Sackville, for a record label called Marshmallow, for a record label called Bob Coster and Delmark Records. And so I was able to do quite a bit of that over the over the years, and that was quite fulfilling for sure. I will say that one of the things that's interesting to me about the Clayton Scott Group was how that came about. Was that there was a radio station called Wave 94.7, and one of the things for you to start a radio station or any kind of broadcasting company in Canada is you need to be committed to what's called Canadian content. So that's why I don't know if anybody's ever watched a Hollywood film and, you'll see Will Smith running down what's supposed to be Times Square and you recognize like Princess Margaret Hospital in the background or something. I mean, you see this all the time where there's Canadian locations or Canadian actors or Canadian editors or script writers or whatever it is that are attached to big Hollywood films. And the reason for that is because for these companies to come in and have the benefit of all the great things we have up here, they have to commit to Canadian content. And so that was another fortunate, I'll say it was good fortune, but I guess I will also acknowledge that it was hopefully a good business decision on my part, where this radio station had started up, they needed Canadian content, and basically I helped provide it. So it was really, it wasn't creativity necessarily that was fueling that particular musical project, although I would say that it was very creative. It was really a business opportunity, and it was quid pro quo. They needed something from me ostensibly, and I was looking to establish myself and make a living. So and that's something that I tell a lot of people was that, that was a good opportunity. And then when I became a songwriter or a composer as a result of that, because I wrote a lot of the music, I ended up learning a lot about the business. I ended up registering with SOCAN, which is a performing rights organization. I ended up getting hooked up with Resound, getting hooked up with something with mechanical rights, a reproductive, it's called CMRRA, the Canadian Mechanical Rights and Reproduction Agency. And then I started trying to figure out how I was going to, I suppose, monetize my music, not just in terms of live performance, but through recordings and also through things like placements. And so that's where I've actually been able to be, to have some success, is that the music that I recorded on some of these recordings ended up in like a John Woo movie, a CBC show, well, Kim's Convenience. I had some music on Kim's Convenience, so it was in a couple of Adam Agoyan movies have had my music in it. I don't know if these names are meaningful, but to anybody, but yeah, just I've had the good fortune to have my music placed. Not as like I'm not Danny Elfman. I'm not composing the score. That's not something that I've done. Oh, I actually have composed one score for a film called After Lola, But generally, it's been, it's been more sort of what I would call interstitial music. There's a scene, somebody wants a piece of music, and so I provide a catalog. It's not like they send me the scene and say, write something that fits. It's more like I provide people with the catalog of music, and I have a sense of what it is. Like, I own the publishing, I own the copyright, you can use it for a fee. And that's actually also been a good lesson in how to monetize your artistic creations and how to make some money. So I guess I would say that during that time in the 2000s, when I was doing a PhD, recording records, I was also doing a bunch of teaching, because that's sort of what you do if you're a PhD. I was teaching a little bit at Ryerson. I was teaching at York. I was teaching at the University of Western Ontario, the University of Guelph, Ontario, and I was also teaching at Humber College. So I was doing a lot of driving around on the 401, playing gigs, trying to establish myself and have a career, and also doing a lot of teaching. And so that was really a big part of the 2000s, until I finally got a full-time job in 2010 at Humber College, which sort of facilitated me not doing all of the other adjunct teaching at all of these other universities and colleges. And I mean, I guess I could just sort of summarize the last few years by saying I've maintained a pretty busy musical practice, as much as I can, doing recordings, teaching lessons privately, but also teaching at the college. I moved into administration, which is kind of maybe like being a principal at the high school level. I was an associate dean and a dean of a School of Creative and Performing Arts. I'm now back teaching as a professor and a chair of a music program. And just trying to combine all of these different things, right? Sort of a day job, private lessons, teaching, musical compositions that give you residuals, music placement into film and TV and commercials and those sorts of things. And then all of it together, has amounted to a busy life, no doubt. But also, again, as I said at the beginning, hopefully a fairly rich one with experiences and opportunities. So
the first thing I wanted to do is address the rest of you guys to see if you had any questions. If you guys maybe want to throw something in the chat or unmute your mic.
I have a question.
Hi, Ben.
Hi. When you were younger, did you always see yourself as going into a career in music, or is that not your first choice, as you talked about how you're studying journalism?
Yeah, and define younger. Like, do you mean like at maybe your age, like as a high school student?
Yeah, maybe late teens or early 20s.
Yeah. Well, no, I guess, to be honest, I mean, whatever. I'm sure I had fantasies about being a rock star or something, as much as anybody else. Probably. I don't really think that at that point I knew what it would take to be a professional musician, or specifically to your question, to have a career in music. I mean, I had a good example of that in my mom, but my skill set, and especially at that point, was so varied from my mother's. My mom was playing solo piano in like fancy hotel lounges, as opposed to as opposed to being a sort of like a freelance, gigging musician. I think the other thing, that's maybe is worth pointing out is that in many ways, the barrier of entry into becoming a musician today is much lower than it was when I was a teenager. I mean, now you can. This is a music studio for many people, there are platforms that are socially curated and socially mediated that are ways of disseminating your music. That wasn't the case when I was growing up. When I was growing up, if I wanted to make a record, I mean, I had to book Manta Sound at, $8,000 a day and get a record. I mean, which obviously didn't happen because I didn't have that money. I didn't have those connections. It just didn't exist in the same way. So I certainly didn't see any kind of models where I could envision myself having a career in music, I guess I would say. So I did, you know, so I think it's a blessing and a curse, though, you know, Ben. I mean, I would say on one hand, the barrier of entry is lower, but what that also has meant was that it's more saturated. You know, there's more. It's more of a crowded space now. There's more people trying to do that. You know, I'm sure if you are interested in music as you all are, you probably follow many of your friends who, or maybe even yourselves, that have Instagram accounts that disseminate your own musical and artistic creations. And again, that just didn't happen when I was a teenager. So I guess the short answer is no. I mean, I fantasized about being a rock star just as much as I fantasized playing left wing next to Daryl Sittler. You know, I mean, it was nothing but that. It was a fantasy. And then when it came time to actually, going to university, I thought I would be a journalist originally, you know. So I hope that answers your question.
Thank you.
I'll ask one.
Hi, Liam.
So is there any like one memory or experience you've had that kind of stands out above the rest? Do you, and specifically like a musical experience? Is that what you mean? Or yeah, like in your career?
Yeah, that's a good question. I mean, I guess I will say that I played, so when I was with that band One Step Beyond, I mean, you know, playing the Opera House to however many people that was a pretty good experience. But I guess I will say that, well, maybe I'll give you a two-part answer. On one hand, I would say that when that band played, I remember we did a thing where we played, I think it was the University of, I think it was UBC. We were out in Vancouver playing, and we were on the same bill as a band called Great Big Sea and Big Sugar and maybe Sloan. There were a bunch of bands on this same bill. All of the latter three bands are bands that had much more sort of popular success than the band that I was playing in. But we played on the same stage as them, and we played in front of basically the same audience. And, you know, I don't know how many, but it was, you know, it was over 10,000. I mean, it was like a big, you know, outdoor concert. And that's a pretty exhilarating feeling, you know, to play music in front of, I don't know, I'm going to take a guess here, but in front of 12,000 people or something. I mean, that, you know, and it was, and also Vancouver, if you've ever been out to Vancouver, I mean, it's a beautiful part of the world. It was the summer. It was sort of that nice, beautiful time of night where the, you know, the sun is going down and evening is coming. And it was just like, you know, and just being on stage, playing that music, hearing your own music being played. There's a musician named Bryden Baird, who was the trumpeter or the flugelhorn player in the band. Bryden ended up playing, he toured with Leslie Feist for a very long time. He was with Blue Rodeo as one of the Longhorn Horns, but he was playing trumpet in this ensemble with me. You know, and he's a beautiful melodic player with a gorgeous sound on his flugelhorn. And I don't know, there is something that stands, I mean, that is a memory, Liam, that I have of, you know, looking out at this sort of sea of humanity in this beautiful environment in British Columbia with the sun going down and hearing my friend Bryden play one of my compositions on his flugelhorn. And I thought, wow, that's a nice feeling. You know, that was a special memory for sure. And then I guess the other quick sort of other anecdote that I would give to your question is that on the other hand, you know, I've also had incredibly meaningful experiences musically where it hasn't been in front of 11,000 people, you know. Maybe it's playing a small little club, maybe it's playing the Rex Hotel in Toronto, or maybe playing a small club. And I guess what I would say was that I mean, I'm sure to all of you, I seem old. I guess maybe I am old, I'm 50. But, you know, when I was your age, I looked up to musicians that were probably my age now. And some of those musicians are people that later in my career, I ended up on the bandstand with, or getting hired by, or on recordings with. And that's also a neat feeling, you know, to be able to sort of to share the stage with, you know, somebody who is basically one of your musical heroes, you know, and somebody that, like, I did a lot of, one thing that I do a lot of is I do a lot of transcribing, you know, where I'll listen to somebody play off of a recording, and I mean, I don't always notate it, but I'll learn you know, it's good for your brain. It's good for your fingers. You know, I'll learn pieces of music that way. I'll learn solos and improvisations. And that's a pretty neat thing, you know, like there were people that I transcribed their solos of when I was a Humber College student in 1994 that I then end up on a bandstand with years later. So that's a sort of a satisfying metric to see that, you know, maybe I've progressed and that I'm reaping the rewards of some hard work over the years. So that's another nice memory to acknowledge too, Liam. So thanks for that opportunity to talk about that.
Awesome. Is there anyone else who has a question?
Well, hello, and Andy, thank you very much for talking to us today. I see how like you had this like classical influence as you like from a young age, and then like kind of spread out into like the more like jazz rock genre. What advice would you give to young musicians who are like learning about jazz and like learning to connect and mold these different genres of music together in their playing?
Yeah, thank you. That's a great question. Yeah, it's true. That's good. Like, I'm trying to think of how to answer that question. I mean, I guess on one hand, I would say that it's important for me with jazz music to think about the roots of the music. You know, the roots of this music were, I mean, listen, of course, embedded in American culture, embedded in African American culture. But also that music was a communal music. It was a participatory music. In many ways, it was actually a folk music. And when I use that term folk music, sometimes people think Gordon Lightfoot or, you know, the Mumford and Sons or something like that. But I don't mean like that. I mean a folk music in the sense that it was not necessarily commodified. It was not a music that was attached to a lot of money, at least at those early stages. It was a music that was disseminated by oral means. So it wasn't, people were not necessarily writing things down. There weren't sort of scores, platonic captures of this music. It was more something that happened in real time. It was improvised, and it was communal and participatory. And so I've really tried to embrace that in my music. You know, I think that sometimes jazz music, and maybe even jazz musicians, and maybe this is fair, I don't know, but have a kind of a reputation for being, I don't know, elitists, you know, because it's a difficult music and it takes a lot of a time and dedication, you know. But what I would say was that I also think that if you look at the nature of this music from the get-go, it was an egalitarian music. And so why I bring that up, Lauren, is because, you know, you mentioned classical music and rock music and folk music. You know, I mean, you know, and I think that all music is valid. I mean, there are things that you can learn from hip hop. There's things you can learn from classical music. There's things that you can learn from jazz music, from folk music, and from music from heavy metal, from whatever. I mean, there's lots and lots of lessons that can be learned. And I think just having an open mind and open ears to all of these different musical styles is going to be very beneficial for you, you know, and just to really be a kind of a sponge, I would say, and soak up all of the music and all of the opportunities, because, you know, jazz music in many ways is a kind of a feeder discipline. You know, it's taken a little bit from classical, a little bit from marching band traditions, a little bit from American show music, a little bit from the blues, a little bit from, you know, dance bands. I mean, you know, and then as jazz music has gotten, you know, like the kind of jazz music that I play is more rooted historically, but there are musicians out there today who continue to do things, right? They're borrowing from hip hop and from drum and bass and from rap music, and, you know, from all like so in that sense, it's a kind of a feeder genre that brings a lot into it. So that's number one, I guess I would say, is maintain an open mind and listen and expose yourself to as much music as you possibly can, because that will enrich your musicianship, no doubt. But then at the same time, I would say, you know, it's also good to be respectful of the different genres. Like if you're learning classical music, there's a kind of a language to classical and a performance, you know, technique to classical. I mean, a good example of that would be like if you're a piano player, I don't know if anybody's a piano player in here, but generally, like jazz piano players have splayed fingers. They play flat fingered on the piano to do, you know, large voicings and those kinds of things. Well, that's not really how classical piano players play. And in fact, I would say that if you tried to play classical piano that way, I mean, I'm sure some people can do it, but it just doesn't maybe sound as convincing. And the flip side of that is also true, that you need to find technique. I think you need to expose yourself to a wide variety and a wide swath of music, but you need to articulate your own techniques that make the music sound a certain way. I mean, I can sort of demonstrate. Mason, may I demonstrate something?
Yeah, of course.
Yeah. I mean, like I used to think about stuff like when I first played guitar. Like, okay, a perfect example of this is, there's two examples. On the right hand, I used to think that this sort of up and down motion, da 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 da, what they call alternate picking, is the most efficient. And probably it is, you know, because, you know, you're going a downstroke, then you're doing an upstroke, doing a downstroke. There is a sort of, you know, efficiency to that, like this. Whatever. So I'll try and demonstrate maybe something like, okay, so that's sort of efficient picking. And it sounds okay, it sounds pretty good. But what I realized was that when I started to listen to Grant Green, George Benson, you know, Kenny Burrell, Wes Montgomery, musicians, and even some Toronto musicians, you know, Red Schlager, Ed Bickert, Lauren Lofsky, musicians like this. It just didn't sound the same. And I would get really frustrated because I would feel like I was doing everything right. I was doing efficient picking, and I was following what was in the, you know, the books or the literature that I was sort of trying to teach myself with. And then what I realized, I don't know if you can hear the difference, but I'll try and sort of do a similar line. Like, I'm going to do a lot more unidirectional picking. So that is to say, like, either downstrokes or upstrokes. Let me see, get here. There we go. Like, so I'm doing a lot of those sorts of gestures. I don't know if you can tell, but to me, it's much more authentic sounding, you know? And I guess why I say that is because you don't get fans for efficiency. You know, people don't come to hear you, Lauren, because you're an efficient picker. People come to hear you because you make music that sounds good. And that was sort of a light bulb moment for me, where I realized that a lot of the musicians that I listened to did things in very idiosyncratic ways. You know, that they had found ways on the guitar or on the piano or on the saxophone or whatever, or with their voice or whatever it was, to make really meaningful dynamic music that actually probably broke a lot of so-called best practices, you know. Another good example of this is I used to practice the guitar vertically, like what they call position playing. So you can see I'm staying in, sorry, I'm a little out of tune. I'm staying in the same position. So see, so I'll try and demonstrate again. This is the up and down. And here's the down. That one to me sounds more convincing, it's got more rhythmic drive to it. And I was doing all downstrokes in that case, right? It doesn't matter, downstrokes, upstrokes, the idea is the unidirectionality of it. But I was also playing what I would call vertically, right, in position. But actually what I realized is that a lot of people didn't play that way. They played, you know, they would change positions. So if you're going to play jazz music, you're going to probably play a lot, right? like I'm sort of all over the place positionally here. But I think that the point that I'm trying to make is that it sounds better. And that was a hard thing for me to wrap my head around, because I guess I'll just acknowledge, like, I was always a rule follower. And I thought, oh, I have to follow these rules. I have to do the alternate picking. I have to stay in position. I have to learn my modes and my scales and all this kind of stuff. And again, you know, I probably could have practiced hard enough that I would have won, you know, picker of the year and mode player of the year and efficient whatever of the year. But none of those things matter in the grand scheme of things. What matters is the music that you make. So I don't know if that's good advice for you, Lauren, but just trying to always, well, yeah, keep an open mind, understanding the vocabulary and the techniques that are idiomatic to the different genres that you're interested in. And then always pay attention, not just to the pedagogy, but ultimately to what things sound like, because that's ultimately what's most important. I hope that's good advice.
Yes, yeah, thank you. That's really good advice. Thank you.
Thank you.
Andy, I think if you're ready, maybe you could play something for us. I think that's a good time. This is a good time now.
Sure. Okay.
Perfect. Thank you.
Well, sure. Yeah, I was going to play maybe a well, why don't I do that? Why don't I play like a little bit of a blues, Mason, that I was going to demonstrate.
Perfect.
Some of these sorts of techniques.
Whatever you say.
Okay. So I'll do that. I've got a backing track for that.
Perfect.
And then maybe afterwards I'll play like chord melodies.
That sounds great.
Okay.
Awesome.
Okay, so this is, I'm going to play, so this is, I'm using a backing track because sadly I don't actually get to play with human musicians in real time right now. I'm sorry. And if you ever want to invite me back post-pandemic, I can come in and play in person with an actual real human being next to me. But in the interim, this is going to have to suffice. So this is just what they call a backing track, which means that it's, there's a piano and a bass part and a drum part that has been assembled of a blues composition. This is a blues in the key of B flat major. Although the blues is an interesting thing because it's sort of both major and minor at the same time. It kind of has that nice tension to it. The melody that I'm going to play is a melody called Sonnymoon for Two. And it's written by one of the true masters of this music, who fortunately is still alive and among us, although he's not playing any longer, named Sonny Rollins. And he's an American saxophone player, tenor saxophone player. And I think what I'm going to do is I'm going to play, so the blues form is 12 bars in length, okay? So this is 4/4 time, key of B flat, two flats. And the form is 12 bars. So I'm going to play the melody twice. So there's a sort of 24 bar statement of the melody. And then I'll play I'll improvise. And so I'm improvising using mainly my understanding of harmony, the chord changes, the key centers that we're in, and also some sort of idiomatic devices that I associate with this music. I'll play a little bit, and then I'll probably play the melody, and I'll just stop it. So, and then maybe I can answer some questions, okay? So. That was a terrible intro because I'm trying to coordinate my. Let me do it one more time. Here we go. Does it sound okay? Second time. And I'll turn off the backing track. Thank you. Thanks very much. So just maybe I could speak very quickly about that if that would be helpful. Yeah, so the harmony of the tune is this. Okay, that's the 12 bars. 1, 2, 3, 4, 2, 2, 3, 4, 1, 2, 3, 4. Bar 5, bar 6, bar 7, bar 8, bar 9. Okay, that's the 12 bars. And then the melody is so I guess it's what you'd call a riff-based melody. The melody doesn't really interact with the harmony, right? I mean, it's the same. It's sort of the same. It's a three-peat of the same motif. And so you put it together. And I tried to play it sort of twice at the beginning and twice at the end. I sort of failed when I tried to hit the play along. But so basically, that's really the sort of the template for a jazz performance of a certain kind of era, right? Oh, another thing I might say is that it swings. So the swing feel, ding, dang, da, dang, dang, da, dang, dang, da, dang, dang, 1, 2. So it's not ba, 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 ba. It's not that. It's not a straight feel. It's more triplety based. Triplet, but beat up, it's more of a triplet sort of based feel with a lot of syncopation. 1, 2, 3, 4, 1, ba do boo 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 do do. Right? It's not 1, 2, 3, 4, ba da ba. It's on the offbeat. 2, 3, 4, da boo boo dee do dee da bo ba do ee da da ba do bo bo boo boo boo. It's got that sort of lift to it, and that's a really, I mean, I would say that sort of triplet sound, that sort of rhythmic feel, that's a real hallmark of jazz music, of soul music, of actually a lot of musics from the African American diaspora, right? I mean, blues, gospel, soul music. Even aspects of like hip hop and disco actually have that as well. And of course, a lot of that has been, has been appropriated and borrowed and found its way into like rock and roll, for example. So that's that. And so again, that's sort of the typical like template of this performance is where I basically stated the melody twice at the front. So that's often called the head of the tune. And then there's this large section in between where I sort of improvised. I played some kind of melodies that just came to mind. That sort of thing, right? So these are melodies that I know from going through the chord changes. I know because I've listened to like thousands of hours of jazz music that it's like a language. I can sort of speak that, like even if I don't have my instrument in my hand, as you can, I guess, hear with my voice a little bit, I can sort of speak the music because I know the vocabulary at this point fairly thoroughly of a certain era. So again, if this was a real performance, not that this isn't a real performance, but with a real band, so I would have played the melody, I would have taken, I don't know how many choruses, I sort of lost track there, but maybe I took 4 or 5 choruses. So a chorus is 1 time through the 12-bar form. So I probably played that 4 or 5 or maybe 6 times. And then maybe the piano player would play. And then maybe the bass player would. And then you might do something called trading with the drummer, okay? So trading with the drummer could be, you generally trade in increments or divisions of 4 in 4/4 time. So I could have, so I could have gone like this. I'll try and demonstrate, maybe like, drums, 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 drums. Drums, jing, so I'm trading 4s in that sense, right? And it's very conversational. It's very dialogical. There's a dialogue going on, you know, between the musicians, which again I think gets back to the participatory, the communal aspects of this music, the community-based aspects of this music. You know, this is not like classical music. You don't necessarily improvise full choruses, and you know, the head violinist doesn't necessarily trade segments of a Bach piece with the cellist. I mean, that's not really a part of that music's tradition. It doesn't mean that there are not elements of interpretation and improvisation to a certain extent in classical music, but it's just different. You know, it's different than what we're doing here. So then I came back at the end and I played the head or the melody again twice and then did an ending. So I top and tailed it with the melody, and in between the sort of the sandwich of the composition was the improvisation. That if there were more musicians here, we would have had more dialogue and traded. So I hope that was a good overview. Mason, is that okay?
Andy, that was perfect. Thank you so much. Did anyone have maybe any last minute quick questions or comments before we wrap it up?
I can see you're such a great improviser with like all the melodies and the chords. Do you have any advice to like work on that skill?
Sure, I do. Yeah. Yeah, I've got a lot of advice. Like, what instrument do you play, Lauren?
I play the piano.
Yeah. And do you listen to jazz piano players?
I listen mainly to classical, but I'm trying to expand the repertoire as well.
Yeah, that's good. Yeah, sure. I mean, I would say that, okay, I'm trying to think of like there's very specific, I mean, first of all, listening to people is great. I could certainly provide for Mason or for, you know, or type it in the chat. I get some names, but you know, people like Wynton Kelly is a good musician, Red Garland. You know, I think a lot of people start with somebody named Oscar Peterson, who was a wonderful Canadian piano player. But I mean, you know, that's sort of like deciding to play hockey and then using Wayne Gretzky as your template. You know, I mean, he was sort of like at a different level, you know, and can be quite intimidating. So I would try and find some musicians that, yeah, Hampton Hawes, Phineas Newborn Jr., you know, and listen to those musicians, get a sense of their vocabulary. But Wynton Kelly is a good place to start because he didn't sort of have a ton of technique, and I don't mean that as a put down, but he didn't play with a lot of technique, so there was a more of immediacy to it. Yeah, so listening, I think, Lauren, is a big part of it, and trying to understand the language. You know, I would say, like, probably the biggest single piece of advice that I could give you would be to do some transcribing. So, like, listen to it, like, find a Wynton Kelly solo. So maybe if I could give you one very specific piece of advice, there's a very famous jazz record called Kind of Blue by Miles Davis. And it was recorded in 1959 in the Columbia Records studio of New York City. And Wynton Kelly is the piano player on the majority of that record. And there's a song called, it's the blues tune on it. Oh, Freddie Freeloader, called Freddie Freeloader. And it's a blues in B flat, sort of similar to what I just played, a 12-bar blues. And try and listen to Wynton Kelly's solo. And actually, I would say try and play along with it. You know, you can, I'm not sure what kind of computer or technology you have, Lauren, but, you know, there are free websites where you can slow things down, you know, to 50% of the time, or even 25% of the time, but the pitch remains consistent. And try and get little phrases. So if Wynton Kelly plays, let me think, you know, if he plays something like, just try and learn that phrase. And then modulate it. You know, those sorts of things. Learn, like, don't get overwhelmed. Just find little nuggets of sort of improvisatory language, and then try and figure out how you can take those and manipulate them in different ways, in different keys, over different chord changes. That's probably my biggest single piece of advice. And it's funny, you know, I mean, I teach at Humber College, as I've told you, and sometimes I will hear people who actually sound really good, like they've got good technique, they can play really strongly, but they don't. But sometimes, and I say this with all due respect, but sometimes it doesn't sound to me like they've actually listened to a lot of this music, because they understand certain things of it, but they don't have the sound or the grammar or the lexicon, you know, at their disposal. And so I guess I can't overstate the importance of checking out recordings, trying to play along, slowing things down. And even if you just like put on the record and play along with it, and maybe you get one note in 100, you know, and then the next time, you know, a week later, maybe you'll get 5 notes in 100, and just incrementally work your way up until you've got that kind of fluency, and can sort of speak the language. I hope that helps.
Yes, that does. Thank you very much.
You're welcome.
Did anyone else have any just last minute comments or questions?
I do have a quick one.
Hi, Ben.
Hi. Could I just ask if you were alternate picking or unidirectional picking in that improvisation you just did?
Yeah, it's a good question. I don't know. I mean, I guess I will say this, and and it's funny, when I say these things, I feel like I sound like a jerk, but if I had secrets, I would tell you all. I'm happy to give you all my secrets. Like some of the picking stuff, I feel is at this point is more intuitive, you know? So I don't really know, but I mean, I could maybe try and slow it down, and you can sort of see. I don't know. Can you see my fingers if I'm doing that? Yeah. So if I were to go like 1, 2, 3, 4. So I don't know. I'm guessing it's a combination. Is that right? Yeah.
Yeah, that looks right.
Yeah, like I do a lot of triplets in my playing. Triplet. Like I try and do that. And I guess for those, I'm doing a lot of like alternate. But if I'm playing eighth notes, I would try and play unidirectionally. Like see, I mean, I'm being sort of self-conscious now, but I think you get, yeah, like that. Yeah, I mean, I think it's really, I try and be intuitive about it, and I try and let the phrase and the sound dictate what I'm trying to do more than the efficiency of alternate picking, you know? And sometimes I even will do, I guess, what people will call sweep picking, where I'll go like, I'm sort of sweep raking my hand over the string. I mean, that's a big, you know, that sort of kind of fast. I'm sorry, I'm getting self-conscious. But like a guy like George Benson, that's big time what he does. Those sort of, like that kind of language is so idiomatic to him. And I've had the good fortune, I mean, this is maybe a story for another time, but I actually flew to Phoenix, to Arizona to hang out with George Benson in his home one time, and that was pretty neat to sit there and watch how he does those kinds of things. Puts his pick on an angle. And if you're Ben, I take it you're a guitar player, are you?
Yes.
Yeah. Okay. I would encourage you to go down a YouTube wormhole called George Benson picking, or Benson picking technique, because George Benson has the ultimate right hand picking, and it doesn't matter what musical style. He angles his pick in a certain way, and it's the same way that Eddie Van Halen played, Santana plays, Steve Morse from Kansas and the Dixie Dregs. I think Bruce Coburn. A lot of people play that way, angle their pick like that. I try and do it. I haven't done it as effectively as others, but I would say check that out, because it'll open up some doors for you.
So I think we're going to wrap it up. Andy, thank you so much for coming, and your playing was fantastic. On behalf of everyone in the Music Council, we really want to thank you so much for your time, and we all got some very, very good takeaways from your career and experience in music. So thank you so much for sharing.
Oh, you're welcome. Thank you for asking me to be here.
For sure.
And I'm really, I mean, it's so nice to meet young people who love music and are engaged in the learning process.